Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests here in-house, we ask that courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced and turned off as we begin. And of course, for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Leading our discussion is Nick Loris. Mr. Loris is our Herbert and Joyce Morgan Research Fellow in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. As an economist, he focuses on energy, environmental, and regulatory issues, the economic effects of environmental policies and regulations, climate change, and many other aspects of free market environmentalism. Before joining us here at Heritage, he was an associate at the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation, and he also served before that as an editorial intern for townhall.com. Please join me in welcoming Nick Loris. Nick?
Well, thank you, John. Welcome to all of you, those in person as well as those joining us during our webcast here. And a special thank you to the Federalist Society for co-hosting this event. If I could make one small change to the title of the event, which is Time to Reform the Jones Act, ? I would replace the word reform with repeal, and I would change the question mark to about 13 exclamation points. At any rate, we've got a star-studded lineup here of panelists today, and this is one of those topics that's extremely interesting to me. It's also insanely frustrating from a political perspective, which our panelists will get into for a whole host of reasons. I'm betting most of you know what the Jones Act is, but for those of you who don't, it's a section in a very, very old law. In fact, it's so old that 2 months after the Jones Act became signed into law as part of the Merchant Marine Act, the 19th Amendment was ratified, guaranteeing women the right to vote.
And they would have voted against it.
More specifically, the Jones Act is Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which requires that shipments between two U.S. ports be U.S. built, U.S. manned, and U.S. owned vessels. Because of this act, it is more expensive to ship supplies between two U.S. ports than it is to ship supplies abroad. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that exhibits and illustrates the economic inefficiencies and downright absurdities with this act. There's a great podcast on NPR's Planet Money a few years ago that told the story of a Hawaiian rancher who, to avoid using pricier Jones Act vessels, would ship his cattle to Canada and then have them brought down for U.S. consumption. And when that didn't work out, he decided to scrap using vessels altogether and just fly them to the United States. And so what NPR's Zoe Chance said, when cows fly, it's a sign that there are some real distortions in the maritime shipping business. Then again in 2014, New Jersey couldn't get rock salt from Maine to treat its icy roads, despite the fact that Maine had 40,000 tons of it and there was a vessel sitting there. Because that vessel was not Jones Act compliant, the salt couldn't be shipped. Now, defenders of the Jones Act will say this is poor planning, but the reality is this act makes it excruciatingly more difficult to match supply and demands. Now, those are just some of the kind of head-scratching stories that are out there, but the costs spread much further than that to farmers, to the energy industry, and in aggregate, as a multi-billion-dollar price tag to consumers all across the United States through higher prices from all of these goods that we're shipping from U.S. port to U.S. port. Not to mention it particularly harms our non-contiguous states and territories like Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Now, proponents will say these high costs are not that high if you spread them across the consumers. It's one proponent of the Jones Act said it's basically free or costless because those costs are so minuscule. So I hope our panelists will get into that. The other proponents of the Jones Act will say that those high costs are a small price to pay for the national security benefits that are derived from the act. Is that really the case? I think the simple answer is no, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists as to why that's not the case. So with that said, let me introduce our panelists who will dive into the history of the Act, get more into the specifics and into the weeds, talk about the economics of it, the politics of it, and the national security aspects. First up, we're going to start in the middle, actually, with Rob Cortell, who is a multi-sector entrepreneur, a former member of the U.S. Federal Maritime Commission, an internationally recognized expert on U.S. national maritime and transportation security policy, and chairman and founder of Intellex, based in McLean, Virginia. This company provides advanced robotic decision support technologies and applied risk and decision analytic solutions, which are applied widely to food and product safety, program eligibility, fraud solutions, solar energy finance, international truck transit, and in other professional services. In the early 1990s, Rob was the leading advocate for international shipping deregulation and reform of archaic U.S. maritime laws, taking on much of the maritime industry's encrusted interests, including unions, shipyards, and ship operators alike. Rob has been a business and policy entrepreneur and an innovator throughout his career, including in high-speed rail, innovative shipbuilding technology, data process automation, and more. He has run 3 times for federal office, including for U.S. Senate in Florida, and has written and testified extensively on maritime and security issues and modern technology challenges. He's involved in numerous technology startups as an investor and an advisor. Following Rob will be Jonathan Waldron, who is a partner at the law firm Blank Rome, where he concentrates his practice on maritime international environmental law, including maritime security. John counsels clients both domestic and internationally in areas such as environmental maritime compliance and pollution response, vessel and facility operations, Jones Act, coastwide trade, maritime security compliance, citizenship and crewing issues, and a number of other issues. Mr. Waldron heads up the firm's maritime practice and is ranked by Best Lawyers of America, Chambers USA, Law 360, DC Super Lawyers, and Who's Who Legal as a leading shipping and maritime law attorney. Mr. Waldron served in the Coast Guard for 20 years, attaining the rank of commander. He served as a senior counsel to the Marine Spill Response Corporation following his service in the Coast Guard. He is a graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and the University of Miami School of Law. Mr. Waldron is also a visiting professor at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy, where he teaches on legal issues related to pollution response and spill management teams. He is a member of the Maritime Law Association and frequently speaks and writes on maritime issues. And batting third is James Coleman, who is a professor at the Dedman School of Law at Southern Methodist University. James received 2 degrees from Harvard University, a JD and a BA in biology. Upon graduation from law school, he served as a clerk for the 8th Circuit Judge Steve Colleton, and then practiced energy, environmental, and appellate law as an associate in Washington, D.C. in the firm of Sidley Austin for 3 years. Before joining SMU, he was on the faculty at the University of Calgary, where he taught at both the law school and the business school. He also served as the provincial government as a part of the Alberta Royalty Review Expert Panel, which reformed and modernized management of Alberta's vast oil and gas resources. Before Calgary, he served on the faculty at Harvard Law School as the Klemenko Fellow and Lecturer on Law. Professor Coleman's scholarship addresses regulation of North American energy companies. He focuses on increased scrutiny of investment in pipelines, power transmission, and liquefied natural gas, examining how countries account for and influence regulation of oil, gas, and electricity in their partners, and exploring how global energy companies respond to competing pressures from investors and regulators in multiple jurisdictions. Professor Coleman teaches oil and gas law, energy law, international petroleum transactions, and energy transport and trade. And those are their abbreviated biographies. If I just read their whole biographies, the panel would be over. So we've got a very esteemed panel here today, and I look forward to their remarks. And Rob, we'll begin with you.
Great. Thank you. I'm recovering from a little bit of a cold, so I'll probably be a little hoarse here. So, speaking of horses, cows. That cattle story is it's not apocryphal. About 20 years ago, I received a phone call from a guy representing the Hawaiian Cattlemen's Association. And in fact, they did have exactly that problem. It wasn't just one guy, but the whole industry. They had built a high value cattle industry. For years, they had shipped grain from the United States out to Hawaii. You know, the process is you grow the calves, and then you fatten them with grain, and then you slaughter them and all the rest. And at some point, they ran out of the ships that could carry the grain. So they started shipping their calves back to the United States instead on cattle carriers. So there's two ships we're talking about right now. And at some point, there were no more cattle carriers. And they all had to be Jones Act vessels, meaning built, bought, manned, owned, operated American. So when that happened, what they decided to do instead was they sought an alternative. The only major line out there is Matson Navigation. Matson proposed, Jones Act carrier, that they ship them in containers. And they would modify the containers, that they cut them in half. They'd call cow-tainers. So when they did that a couple times, the die-off rate for cattle in a normal vessel across oceans probably 1%. They had about 4 or 5%. That's way out of what you want. So they started exploring empty backhauls on airplanes, and that is exactly what they did. They would ship the calves, to the United States, railroad them over to the fat stock yards, feed them the grain, and then they would slaughter and sell. So that illustrates a lot of the commercial aspects of the fleet. So if you talk to an advocate for the Jones Act, and just a couple weeks ago, Congressman Duncan Hunter, who's one of the major apologists for the industry, held a hearing in which he had a number of owner-operators like Matson and Todt and others, and he had the labor unions, and of course, from their point of view, it was fabulous. Fabulous. You're getting a great deal as a client. We're getting a great deal for national security. No shippers, meaning the people who own the cargo and ship on these ships, were present or invited at all. And that's very typical of the way the Maritime Administration handles it, the government handles it, all of whom are enthralled to these interests, and certainly the way the Congress has historically handled it. So there are 2 or 3 arguments that the proponents make from the beginning. One is it's a law that was written to support national security, meaning to build a vast and mighty armada of ships that we can use in times of war, call up on short notice and ship goods with American sailors shipping these ships, and a big shipbuilding industry that will be existing because they have to keep supplying ships in time in the off times from war. The reality is it's anything but that. In 1991, when I was Maritime Commissioner, we had the Gulf War, and I decided to look at the statistics, and about 480-some ships went to the Gulf War. The bulk of those were foreign flagged. They did a great job. One ship crew held up the ship. They were Germans because they were not getting war pay, and Americans were, and the ship eventually sailed. They replaced the crew. Something like 85 American deep draft self-propelled ships actually went into the war carrying cargo. And near the end of the war, they discovered one Jones Act ship on the beach in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, I think. They fixed it up in time for it to carry some containers over to the war. So that was the extent of the Jones Act contribution and the extent of the U.S. flag fleet contribution. And you have to understand there are lots of different nuances. So I dove into that. We have dropped from about 25% international trade carried to the country to and from on U.S. flagships, not all of which are Jones Act, by the way, down to 1%. We had something like, I think it was 400 and some thousand, I can't know, it was 60,000 sailors in 1955 after the war. And today we have about 1,100 qualified sailors to sail these Jones Act type ships. We are the 25th or 6th largest fleet on the planet. China has 800 and some ships, and we have roughly 89 flagships, deep draft flagships. And by the way, I haven't been in this industry and on this topic in a long time. The reason I don't have to wear a tie is I'm in technology, not unlike these guys. So, but the numbers just keep getting worse and worse. So if there's any issue you could think of on which the assertions of the people who support it are completely and patently, provably wrong, this is the one law that you could find. There is no other law on which there is so much agreement by everyone but the people who benefit, and it's a very small set of people. It's basically 3 shipyards who have built 40 ships only because the law requires the people who buy them to buy them from these yards, of which 30 were oil tankers or product tankers. We have dropped to almost nothing in terms of sailors to sail the ships that might be there if they were, but they're not. The Jones Act fleet is virtually non-existent and doesn't actually go into war. The U.S. flag fleet is under an operating subsidy, and under the new operating subsidy, if they get called to war, they actually, sort of like the Civil War, if you were drafted, you could get someone to replace you. And they, if drafted, can get someone to replace them who might happen to be a foreign flag ship, but they're responsible, but they can get a replacement. And we are among only about 4 countries that actually have a law like this, where it's build, buy, man, own, operate. And what you'll hear from the supporters is everybody has a law like this. They don't. Only 4 have all of these things, and only 4 have the shipbuilding requirement. If we had time to get into it, and I'm going to wrap up really quickly so we can create a conversation. The factors here are that ships cost too much. It costs 3 to 5 times as much to build a ship here in the United States as anywhere else. It's not because our labor is better. It's not because our laws are tougher on technology or anything else or safety. It's purely because we don't build enough ships and don't have enough demand. That's big ships. Among small ships, we're basically a global leader. Our barge yards push out 4,000 ships a year, very competitive, lots of competitors. Our small boats and tenders and all those have lots of competitors, but not in the ships that we think of as national security. So the ships are gone, the sailors are gone, the cost is high, and going back to the fundamentals, it's no surprise that it's like this. The first assertion out of anyone's mouth from the other side, and unfortunately many of us will tip our hat to it, is that the Jones Act, the Merchant Marine Act, was written for national security purposes. First of all, it wasn't. The Jones Act is not the Merchant Marine Act. The Merchant Marine Act was written after World War I. We had no fleet. We hadn't built enough ships in time, for a war. And so they tried to remedy this by basically selling the ships that the government had accumulated back into the private market to build shipping companies and to create an industry and to subsidize all the segments of it. The Jones Act was really a separate kind of bill and a handful of words that Senator Wesley Jones ended up inserting into the bill on the floor in order to protect his railroads from competition from foreign ships. So the railroads running up and down the East Coast into Alaska were losing cargo to Chinese ships and Canadian ships, and as were some American flag ships to the Canadians. So the bottom line, and my close here, is that the Jones Act was intended to move cargo off of ships and onto railroads, and that's exactly what it's done. So it wasn't for national security. It was to protect a specific segment of a specific industry, and it has had all of the same destructive effects that you would expect it to have. And if there's one last closing point, it's whatever you hear out of the other side, it's going to be disingenuous, a lie, a half-truth, and nothing more or less. And I seriously mean it. So happy to discuss it.
Thanks. Well, I'm not here to advocate reform of the Jones Act. My goal here today is to talk about some very recent events and to better help the country and people understand how our system works. The Jones Act has a very important place. The question is, when the Jones Act fleet in emergencies, such as we saw in hurricanes, or for other reasons, is not capable to handle the trade, there are mechanisms that we have that provide for that. And that's what I want to talk about so people better understand it. So first of all, let's talk about the waivers in the most recent, in the hurricanes. most people don't really understand how the waiver process works. A waiver can only be granted for national defense purposes. That's the buzzword. The national defense includes major impacts on the economy. If you go back historically, it very seldom happens. It goes all the way back to the Exxon Valdez, where 2 waivers were granted for Russian skimmers to come in. There were a couple of waivers for the hurricanes in 2005 for very short periods of time. There have been 3 waivers for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the years for short periods of time for for wars, Iraq wars, and part of the hurricanes. And Hurricane Sandy in 2012 was the most recent for these hurricanes. What's really interesting is, and it's important to understand, is that waivers are only granted by the Secretary of Homeland Security when the Maritime Administration essentially certifies there's no U.S. capability. So the process is in place to do that, to ensure that we use all U.S. capability first. It hasn't been perfect, but it's worked fairly well. And I think it's been, and we found a need for it in these particular times. What's really interesting in the waivers that recently occurred was this process was bypassed by the administration. And when I say bypassed, I'll tell you why. There's 2 ways to get a waiver. I told you about the second way. The first way is when the Department of Defense, the Secretary of the Department of Defense makes a request for a waiver, it's automatic. And by automatic, I mean he makes the request to the Secretary of Homeland Security, who then grants the waiver. That was the process used for all 3 of the for the waivers during this hurricane process. What does that mean? That means that there was no requirement, no request for the Maritime Administration to look at U.S. capability. Administration through the Department of Defense was able to get the waiver for national defense under those circumstances. So my point is, it's just something to look into about what we do in the future. The Department of Defense, over the years, has asked for waivers and gets them periodically for certain military reasons. They're not always published. But anyway, I just think the point is that it's something to look at what our process is for these things. The second thing I want to talk about is an interesting development that occurred last year. This has to do with how we operate offshore for oil and gas energy. There is a whole regime of the Jones Act as it's applied to the Outer Continental Shelf. And the Customs and Border Protection has applied the Jones Act offshore. Whether it should or shouldn't be doing that, it has. And for 40 years, Customs and Border Protection issues ruling letters from requests from industry to get approval to operate offshore. These rulings are very inconsistent. Unfortunately, in our government, most agencies promulgate policies or regulations, and the Customs and Border Protection never has. They do it one-off. And so what happened is 3 days before President Trump took office, the Commissioner of Customs under the Obama administration proposed to revoke 40 years' worth of precedent on how you operate offshore. After in response from all aspects of our energy world, including the Jones Act advocates, the energy companies, and the vessel operators, Customs and Border Protection withdrew this on May this year. And what's really interesting is the process that was being used for this was called what's called a 1625 process, which people aren't very familiar with, where the Customs and Border Protection can quickly change the way things are applied without going through a rulemaking, without taking into account the economic and safety impacts, what that may be. So many of the advocates were saying, you really need to withdraw it. If you're going to change the world, you need to do it through the correct process. So we are still waiting for the administration to figure out what to do with this. Because it was withdrawn, that means all these ruling letters are back in place. The interesting part of all this is you have to, and this gets to the point of why this mechanism is in place, is because we have a global economy, a global world when you vie for these contracts. And when you're doing these huge oil and gas projects around the world, and there's no U.S. capability to provide for these large heavy lift vessels, these pipe-laying vessels, and the drilling vessels. They're all foreign flag. So if there was no mechanism for these vessels to operate, there would be no oil and gas operation in the United States. There is very adequate, what we call light construction vessels, to provide the transportation, the merchandise is what the Jones Act was envisioned for, and the Jones Act world has invested billions of dollars to put that capability in place. And it should be doing the transportation. Unfortunately, the ruling letters that exist actually allow foreign flag vessels to do that, which shouldn't be done, which is why it needs to be revoked or revised so that the Jones Act capability can do the job they're supposed to be doing. So anyway, it's just an example of the reason I provide this is to educate people as to it's another part of the Jones Act that needs a revision in order to make sure that the Jones Act capability can do the work they can do, and draws the line to make sure that we can continue for the national defense and energy security of the United States to get this work done. Because if these foreign flag vessels in this case weren't allowed to do that work, there would be no oil and gas development in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll be talking about how the Jones Act is leaving U.S. energy consumers behind with the U.S. energy production boom. So as you all know, that because of hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling, which most people just call fracking, there has been a huge boom in oil and gas production in the United States. But that boom is, in some respects, leaving behind consumers on the U.S. East Coast and in Puerto Rico, because the only way that they could have access to that is through shipping. And it turns out that it's cheaper for U.S. producers to ship their oil and gas to Europe and to Asia without, instead of relying on Jones Act vessels that would take it to Puerto Rico and the East Coast. So in fact, it turns out to be, if you want to ship oil, it's 2 or 3 times cheaper. In other words, it's half to a third the cost to ship that oil to Canada or to Europe than it is to ship it to U.S. consumers. So let me say a couple words about how that's applying first in oil markets and then in gas markets. And then I'll say a couple more words about how the Jones Act is a good example of some of the dysfunctions that you sometimes can have in the regulatory system. So first, if you want to talk about oil, Puerto Rico is a great example because Puerto Rico is extremely dependent on oil. All economies are dependent on oil. We all know that if the price of oil goes up, it can tank the economy anywhere. But Puerto Rico, in addition to relying on oil for transportation, also relies on oil for its power grid, as do many islands. And so, the majority of Puerto Rico's power comes from oil. Now, it's not a great source. It's dirty. But the other problem is that it costs more than it would otherwise need to because low-cost oil supplies can't reach Puerto Rico because you would need to have Jones Act compliant ships that would cost more money. So Puerto Rico imports a lot of its oil from other countries, and meanwhile we have producers sending from the Gulf Coast oil all across the world. On the East Coast, there's kind of a similar story, which is that before the oil export ban was dropped, until just a few years ago, you couldn't export U.S. oil. At that time, East Coast refineries benefited from sort of discounted price of oil because all that oil was stranded in the United States. Now, it would have probably made most sense to transport that by ship, but instead it was, as we just discussed earlier, it was sent by rail. That was what the Jones Act was in some ways intended to do, and that's what happened. And as a result, you had a lot of light oil transported across rails to the East Coast. That led to numerous accidents. We've done some things to improve the safety of railroad transport of oil since that time, but basically we had expensive and dangerous oil transporting by railroads that could have been sent by ship. Since the U.S. crude oil export ban has been removed, and now U.S. producers can export that oil, what they're finding is cheaper to ship it to Europe. That, as a result, has put a lot of pressure on the few U.S. East Coast refineries. The biggest one just declared bankruptcy because it no longer has access. There were several problems, but one is that it no longer has access to those cheap sources of crude. Okay, so as in some ways, absurd as those impacts are on oil markets, they're perhaps more absurd on natural gas markets because if you want to transport natural gas by sea, you have to take that gas and cool it most of the way down to absolute zero, and then put it on a refrigerated ship. It looks like a banana split. If you've ever seen a picture of them, because they have these spherical, balls in the ship that are holding that refrigerated liquefied natural gas. Each of those ships costs $250 million to build. So you're simply not going to build one of those ships for the one-off shipment to the between U.S. ports, especially given that it costs it's much more expensive to build ships in the United States. So that means that you can't transport liquefied natural gas between U.S. ports. And as a result, even though we're sending liquefied natural gas to Asia, we're sending liquefied natural gas to Europe, the United States is importing liquefied natural gas from Trinidad and Tobago and from, when there's a special need for it on the U.S. East Coast, from Russia. So it's obviously an absurd it's an absurd system in which U.S. consumers, American consumers, can't benefit from that U.S. energy boom. And you see that in Puerto Rico as well. It would be better for Puerto Rico to rely on natural gas power, which is much cleaner burning than oil-fired power. But again, it's difficult to receive it that way. Now, I want to say another thing about some of the arguments for the Jones Act. The common arguments you hear, I think, are in some ways based on a misunderstanding about how maritime trade and energy markets, that markets work. So I think there's sometimes this colloquial idea that there's just trade routes. You remember reading your history textbooks, and they showed static trade routes. This is always where cotton goes. This is where this is where certain any other kind of good goes. That is not. That's not responsive to the way that dynamic markets work now. So it might be that if you had stable trade routes that always went the same way, people would go ahead and build a shipping fleet that could take that. But instead, ships are used in dynamic markets to go on different routes all the time. And you see that both in oil and natural gas markets increasingly. So because of fracking, one of the things that it has done is that in oil markets, you have it means that you have much more volatility in production. So U.S. Oil production will go up and down quickly because when you frack for oil, you get a lot more oil at first, and then it tails off really quickly. And so you can have big variations in how much the U.S. is producing at any given time. And that means constant changes in energy markets and in where energy is going. They're not relying as much on sort of long-term trade routes for oil. That is also true in liquefied natural gas. So one big change that's happening in the United States right now is that rather than all liquefied natural gas being built based on long-term contracts where all this natural gas is always going to go to one place, right? It's increasingly based on I'll just find the best price for my liquefied natural gas today. So there's a change in those markets that just mean you're never going to be interested in building a ship that could only serve one market. And so I think that's emblematic of the way that this argument that the Jones Act will eventually lead to U.S. ships, as we can see in practice, has been a failure given the paltry Jones Act compliant fleet that's resulted. But it's also just doesn't accommodate the reality of dynamic markets where trade routes are constantly changing. The last thing that I'd like to say about this is, given our venue, is if you are someone who thinks that regulations, government red tape, et cetera, is holding back energy producers, is holding back the United States economy. As somebody who spends his life talking to young people, teaching them about how regulation works, et cetera, I can tell you that I think that that intuition is not obvious to most people. If you think that regulations are holding back the American economy, you probably think something like, well, look, there's some regulations that are worth it because of the environmental benefits. Then there are some regulations that might be worth it in theory, they're addressing a real problem, but the way they're implemented really doesn't take enough account of the specialized knowledge of people working in the industry. It's not flexible enough to accommodate those, et cetera, and to accommodate that private knowledge. Or you might think, yes, this regulation has some benefits, but it's not worth it overall, and it's being maintained by special interests, often businesses that benefit from those regulations. Now, let me just say that if you're trying to persuade people and your argument depends on them, both understanding, Hayek and Yandel and being entirely on board with these arguments against regulation, you're going to have a difficult time convincing anyone. So I think that the helpful thing about the Jones Act, the thing that makes it an interesting example, is it's an example where we really don't have any benefit on the other side. There's no benefit from this restriction, but you can also see how it doesn't account for some of the realities that take place in energy markets, and it also doesn't account for, and we can see the special interests that benefit from these restrictions on free trade in energy and in other goods.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to open it up to questions in a little bit. Before we do that, I just want to ask a few myself. One thing that I commonly hear is that Americans are not ready to see a foreign mariner strolling up inland waterways. We can't have a foreign mariner going up the Mississippi because of the terrorist threat that it presents. Could one or few of you respond to that?
I'm happy to. The reality is there are no laws that prevent foreign ships from traveling up the Mississippi onto the Great Lakes or any other waterway as long as they are coming from a foreign port and delivering to an American company. You can go through the Great Lakes and all the rest of that and deliver to Canada. So you're half in one and half in the other. In fact, foreign ships do that. The countries where you would worry about terrorism are on a list already and can't do commerce anywhere, so they can't come here. So you know, something like I think it's 99% of all of our cargoes that come from overseas come on foreign flag ships to U.S. ports, and they dock, and the sailors are allowed to get off on a temporary green card equivalent. That's not what it's called. So they're here too, and they, by the way, and the unions would agree with this, go through background checks and very rigorous background checks to work on foreign ships, and so it's a crazy argument, but it is exactly the kind of disingenuous and half-informed argument that I hear all the time.
I'd like to add some comments. I practice a lot in this area, and for people who don't know, since 9/11, there is an incredible vetting process the Department of State goes through before visas are issued. So you got the Department of State first of all. Then when the ships come to the United States, it's called a notice of arrival process. And since 9/11, it is very centralized within the government. Within our government, Customs and Border Protection, the Coast Guard, and other FBI and other agencies look very carefully at every individual that comes in here, and that's why if you look at where we have terrorist issues in the world, you don't see it in the marine world.
Absolutely.
And so that is a myth, I think, that people have. The U.S. I mean, I'm not saying against U.S. versus foreign citizens. I'm saying the foreign people go through this vetting process, and our transportation and the waterways is well protected through this system.
And you would agree with me, probably that's sort of one of those things thrown out there that's not quite true.
It is thrown out
as a
and
diversion.
People really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Rob, can I follow up with that? Would it change any way in which the Coast Guard would operate through inspections or licensing of foreign mariners or ships?
Oh, you probably know more about the licensing. What do you mean by, are the rules different for?
Yeah, or so if we repealed the Jones Act.
Well, that's a good question. So you have international classification societies on the ships, and then we have IMO and others that have rules and a whole set of architecture for everybody. One of the arguments frequently made is that one reason American ships cost more is because our rules are tighter and more restrictive, but they're not. And many people would argue, in fact, that the international regime for shipbuilding is actually much more rigorous because it's much more market-tested than theoretical, which they are for the U.S. So, no, nothing would change. There are some differences, but nothing of any effect.
I would just add that it's called the STCW Convention with Standards for Seafarers, and it's the Coast Guard's job through their Port State Control Program to make sure that people in the United States there are international certificates that are issued, and so that is checked. And frankly, it's a myth in many respects to say that American seamen, that the hiring of American seamen aboard vessels is more expensive than foreign seamen, because if you take the LNG vessels we're talking about, that takes a very sophisticated person. So the cost for crewing is really not, it's pretty equal in many respects. It's not completely across the board, but I think that's another myth that should be demythicized, so to speak, in that
Yeah.
regard.
Well, and that brings up yet another point, which is that frequently proponents will argue that the reason the Jones Act is so expensive is we have to pay more for ships, we have to pay more for crews, and it is true on both counts. But if you were to get rid of the Jones Act, I think you would still be covered under the same laws which regulate shipping and trains and everything else, which govern labor inside the U.S. or inside U.S. points. So I don't think it would have any impact on labor at all. It would clearly have an impact on the capital cost. You know, American Airlines can buy foreign planes. American train companies can buy foreign trains. And I would argue they are every bit, if not more important today to national security than ships.
Shifting gears a little bit toward energy, Secretary Zinke's OCS plan was very aggressive. If these things come to fruition and we open more access, and let's assume that companies are interested in commercially developing these areas in the Atlantic, Pacific, more in the Gulf Coast, does that significantly exacerbate the problems associated with the Jones Act?
Well, I think it does. And I would also note that another thing that makes this a bigger issue now, of course, is that the unprecedented opposition that we're having to other means of energy transport. So, one reason that Boston had to import liquefied natural gas from Russia rather than from the United States is because of the Jones Act. But the reason that it had to import liquefied natural gas at all is because there's not enough pipeline capacity to Boston. So we have the cheapest natural gas in the world in Western Pennsylvania, and twice in the last 4 years, we've had the most expensive natural gas in the world, a few hundred miles away in Boston and New York. And that's because we don't have enough pipeline capacity. So to the extent that we're forced to rely on waterways because we don't have enough pipeline capacity to carry these products to market, then that makes the Jones Act a bigger problem for U.S. energy consumers and also for energy producers. And I should say that that is potentially a very big deal on the West Coast, since California has already promised to blockade any oil production from offshore. So, there are ways that one might challenge that under the Constitution or the Dormant Commerce Clause, et cetera, but that would be a Ninth Circuit suit. It would be very difficult to win for industry to win that kind of claim. And so it may be that oil producers are going to have to find other ways to transport that oil. And if the Jones Act remains in place, that probably means that none of that oil, that new production, comes to the United States.
Okay, let me make one also additional point on that, which is we actually have a very, very robust barge industry in the United States because there are thousands of companies in that space, and there are hundreds of companies that build barges. What we're really talking about here is deep draft, meaning ocean-going capable over 1,000 tons, which sounds like a lot, but it's the opposite of huge. It's teensy. And 400 feet long, 400 feet. So it's basically deep draft, what we're talking about. Ships that are self-propelled and can go into ocean and deep areas. So the barge piece, if you wanted to carry oil in that, it would be cheaper than anywhere else on the planet. But that's it's sort of inefficient for some of that.
If I could connect the dots a little bit on your question too, because this is important to my presentation with regard to what's happening, how customs, the Jones Act is applied offshore in oil and gas. So just because, of course, Secretary Zinke made this announcement, it's very controversial. It's just a starting process. It's unclear what areas will be opened up. But whatever areas opened up, if this problem isn't solved that I mentioned with the how the Jones Act is applied offshore, there will be no capability to bring any additional oil and gas to the United States. And because of the uncertainty it's creating, like I said, this is a global market. So the only vessels that can do this pipe laying and heavy lift and drilling will go somewhere else. There's no reason to waste their time and uncertainty here. The market's already down. They're going to go away. So it's going to have an adverse effect on the national security of the United States, energy security, if we don't allow all these vessels, the U.S. interest and the foreign interest, to work together, solve the problem. That's what we need for this country.
Great. Last question, then we're going to open it up. And it's kind of broad. How do you get people riled up about this issue? I mean, as you mentioned, James, it's a great example of concentrated benefits, dispersed costs. There's particularly some industries that are affected more than others. But if you're not a Hayekian or someone who is in the energy industry who has maybe bigger fish to fry too, how do you engage consumers on this? How do you just rile up an anti-Jones Act aggregate of people?
Well, we'll try to start today. So I'd love people to be riled up. And also, I mean, to be honest, part of my job is teaching people about how energy markets work. And so I'm happy to do that every day. But I think probably it's going to be what people find most absurd are these examples, whether it is the increased cost to an island that's bankrupt and losing population. Just last week, they notified the power utility had to put out a notice that they would be cutting back their purchase of fuel supplies. They're still 6 months after the storm, 5 months after the storm. We have 20% of the population without power, and even those people who have power are going to have to experience brownouts or rolling blackouts because the utility can't afford fuel. So I think there's these examples, whether it's Puerto Rico that are particularly absurd that one can point to, or I think the other way is just learning more about how these energy markets work.
So there is a history of this. So after I got my call from the Hawaiians, they were calling to set up the so-called Jones Act Reform Coalition, and the idea was to get American businesses affected by this and consumers to join that. And this was literally 20 years ago. We had a group of over 100 associations ranging from the National Taxpayers Union, Grover Norquist, to the American Farm Bureau, to the American Salt Institute, to everyone you could think of and anyone whom anyone in this room would identify, both from a political, ideological, sometimes non-ideological, and philosophical and consumer point of view. We represented over 1 million companies in that. The group we had, there were 2 of us, 3 actually. So we were funded the first year at a certain level. The second year it gets harder. The third year was harder, and we were outspent directly and indirectly 20 to 25 to 1. And what we actually only proposed then was only to get rid of the shipbuilding requirement. So ships cost 3 to 5 to 6 to 8 times as much here in the U.S. as they do otherwise. They don't perform better. They are not built better. They are not more safe. As a consequence, we buy very few. The fleet is one of the oldest on the planet. The typical lifespan of a container ship is 20 years. Ours are on average 35, 36, 38. Our tankers are older. Our service vessels are older, the big ones. The labor would not have been affected, as you mentioned earlier. And in the end, we really kind of just got overwhelmed by the inability of people to act. John McCain stood up then, but he wasn't enough. Representative Jones, Walter Jones from North Carolina, the farmers were all over it. They couldn't get grain from the Midwest, so they were buying from Latin America. So it just sort of petered out because of that. But I do think the times are different. We have social media. If we'd had social media, we could have made a better case. I went to the Propeller Club. I'm a member a number of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, and they were in an uproar and aghast because former governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin, had just tweeted about the Jones Act, about how we had to get rid of it. And of course, Alaska is one of the 2 states that suffer the greatest impact, and they were the original victim. After this provision was inserted, they took it to the court, and the court said, well, they said it's applied unequally to Alaska. We are mainly now enthralled to the city of Seattle, and they would have won, but they were a territory, so they had no standing. Effectively, that was the outcome. So I think these are different times. I think there's a lot more focus. Bloomberg has written on it, a number of articles. The Wall Street Journal guys are in it. Tom Grenius, you guys, and many of you in this room. And I think there's a danger. I do think that there are people in high places who, hearing about this, will say, oh, American this and American that is great. This is how we make America great again. You know, we make sure that everything goes in American ships. Well, you know, that's kind of crazy. If I were going to do it, I'd go out and buy 400 ships off the world market. They're at their lowest price in decades. I'd reflag them. I would eliminate the build requirement, and you'd have a fleet, and you'd have ships, and they could compete under market price today against international. But it's probably not going to happen. I think, you know, one last point. Trent Lott, probably 15 years ago, said to me, he said, "Rob, you have created more business for more lawyers in this town than anyone I know," which is true, because I also was trying to abolish my agency and eliminate and deregulate shipping. And he said, "It's not going to go away till I'm gone and Senator Breaux is gone and Senator Inouye is gone and Ted Stevens is gone." And they're gone.
All right, let's open it up. If you can just wait for the microphone, please state your name and affiliation, and keep it to a quick question if you can. We're going to start in the back here.
Hi, my name's Tom Dunn. I'm a consultant. Just a quick question. If we still had the old Merchant Marine and Fishery Committee in the House that was abolished 23 years ago, have there been a better forum for repealing the Jones Act? And would Sealand, without the Jones Act, would Sealand potentially be still an American-owned company instead of being taken over by Maersk? It just seems like the industry founded by McLean, you know, there's no American-owned company anymore. Thank you.
So 2 of the last 5 chairmen of the Merchant Marine Committee went to jail. So I don't think so. I think that was one of the great things. Actually, I forget, forgotten what one of the issues that triggered this in 1996 was that the advent of Newt Gingrich and the Reform Congress. And we thought they would be reformers, and Gingrich said he was with us. But, in political speak, that means I'm not going to take any risks. And he abolished the Merchant Marine Committee really for that reason. It was about as corrupt an institution as there could possibly be in the Congress of the United States, and we know that's a pretty low bar. So Sealand is a really great. I knew the founder of Sealand, and he had great hopes and aspirations. Well, he was CSX, and Hayes, and then his later successor. And I don't know. I think if they could have bought, they wrestled with the subsidy issue for years, as you may remember. They opposed subsidies of the ship, the operating subsidies, until one day the law changed enough that they could get them. And they were also prohibited from being in Jones Act markets. And all these things work together to destroy the fleet, destroy the shipyards, destroy the mariners' employment base, and to harm, in a distributed way, the American economy. So maybe.
Up front here.
Name's Dave Onspach, retired. Question is on this Jones Act thing: are the pro-Jones Act supporters mostly Republican, Democrat, or is it cut across the party lines, or is it is the Democrats more on one side than the other? And you're talking about Duncan Hunter supporting the act, and he was Republican. Is Donald Trump a supporter of this Jones Act? He's a Republican. Seems like he's a supporter. Does it come across the party lines, or or is it you know what I'm saying, or Republicans mostly on one side or the other? That kind of thing. You see what I'm saying?
I'm happy to answer. You can, but I would argue that there's no political boundary here. The common characteristics are that they have a shipyard, they have a shipping company, or they have boilers. The Boilermakers Union and masters, mates, and pilots and sailors out of the Jones Act fleet. You don't see people in the Coast Guard, by and large, who understand what goes on supportive. You don't find people in the Navy or other government programs that have to use limited U.S. flag ships. They're always going for waivers, as he knows. So that's the main characteristic. And the industry spends massive amounts of money. the amount of money that, you know, I love Ted Stevens, but Ted would go up to Alaska and pound away at the Jones Act, and then he'd go back to Seattle and take a bunch of money that Tote raised for him in Seattle. So they all do that. It's money, and I do think it's ignorance. And, you know, this national security argument really resonates, even though it's completely false by any objective measure. It has destroyed, the Jones Act has destroyed not only the domestic deepwater fleet, but the American international fleet. And it has destroyed 60, 70,000 jobs with it. And so, for example, Puerto Rico says we've invested billions. I mean, not Crowley in Puerto Rico. 500,000 people, 500,000 people, whatever the number is, would lose their jobs if you got rid of the Jones Act. They're all on the shore. Puerto Rico is still going to need people to unload ships and put them in warehouses. You know, the numbers they use are inflated. It is so complicated. That's why I say it's disingenuous or half-truths. And sometimes, as I say, it is downright lies.
Let me suggest another way. This is, in response to your question, a very interesting moment for the Jones Act. The president,
Yeah.
during the campaign, didn't take any kind of position
Right.
on the Jones Act, and that's very unusual. As Secretary Clinton was very clear, I support the Jones Act. She put out an official statement of support, and so this is interesting because I don't think anybody really knows what the administration wants to do ultimately with the Jones Act, and because there was no commitment during the campaign, et cetera, there is an opening for reform or repeal with however many exclamation points you'd like. But so, and that makes it interesting. And it's also an interesting area because it's one of those areas where there might be, at a rhetorical level, some tension between a sort of America first approach and a energy dominance approach. Now, I think as has been mentioned, I think there are lots of ways that the Jones Act really doesn't benefit Americans and is, in fact, benefiting consumers abroad at the expense of Americans. But certainly the rhetoric behind it, plays into sort of one side of that dynamic that you're seeing in the new administration.
So, and let me just clarify, too. I'm not against a maritime industry. I actually believe that it would be a good thing. Remember, I regulated cartels, international cartels, and the reason I wanted to abolish the agency, the FMC, was because our job was to give antitrust immunity to foreign shipping companies forming cartels. So I think it would be hugely in our interest to have a competitive international fleet. And we're not getting there.
Down here.
Hi, Rachel Adams, Heard with S&P Global. I had a question about the liquefied natural gas industry. They've kind of gone silent on this topic, and I'm curious if that surprises you in light of this Russian cargo of LNG, and whether you see that picking back up or opposition picking back up once more supplies comes online.
Well, I don't think anybody thinks it would take a while to be in a position where you had competitive, any kind of shipbuilding on that scale, et cetera. These are really the biggest possible, or almost the biggest possible ships. So I think for the LNG industry, it's more of a long-term issue. And the reality is, for producers like consumers, this is a diffuse cost. It costs everybody a little bit of money. That may not be where they want to use their political capital. Notice who is, it's very, very interesting that a senator from Arizona is our main opposition to this policy. What does a senator from Arizona care about maritime transport, right? This is the kind of issue that is very important to people who care about rational regulation, about diffuse cost to the American economy. But there are some examples of people who are directly harmed for it, and those are important to tell this story. But the bulk of the costs fall on all of us. And the bulk of the benefits are concentrated in ways that allow an industry to be particularly powerful in policy making.
And that's a really important point. We could not get the oil industry. They would say, keep doing it, keep doing what you're doing, but they would never put a penny in it. And it's because they're bigger fish to fry. It's, you know, it's 1 or 2 cents on every gallon of gasoline, but that doesn't cost them, it costs you.
All right, we're in the lightning round here, so if you guys can follow up with your last 2 questions and just ask them at the same time, and then we'll run through answers.
Thank you. Blaine Collins, DNVGL. Rob, you gave some really staggering figures about the decrease in number of shipyards, the number of ships, the number of shipping companies, the number of seafarers, and so on. And you've also commented that that the pro-Jones Act supporters and advocates are spending an outrageous amount of money because they benefit from this. But it seems to me the crazy thing is that although they're spending tremendous sums of money and fighting for this, the preservation of this law, that they're actually committing to an ever-decreasing pie. Why is it that these shipyards and these shipping companies don't see that they're basically putting themselves on a path to extinction?
I have a
Yeah, go ahead.
quick follow-on.
Sure.
I'm James Gibney from Bloomberg View. I wrote the editorial series. Great, you guys are doing this panel. And my question is, I'd like to get your sense of whether or not you think there's a likelihood that Duncan Hunter and company will prevail in making sure that exports of U.S. energy are carried on Jones Act ships. And I'd also just like to add one, but just 3 quick points. It's not just offshore oil and gas; it's also wind farms. And the other thing is that in looking at political donations, one of the most striking things to me was Alaska and Hawaii were the biggest recipients. So it's quite remarkable the extent to which they have people in the bag. But thank you for doing this panel.
So a little bit off your target, but we calculated that the International Trade Commission calculated the cost of the Jones Act 20 years ago was at least $1 billion across the U.S. economy. That's not a lot of money, but we calculated that half of that landed on Honolulu alone. Yet Senator Inouye was one of the biggest supporters of that, and they do everything to manipulate outcomes. So he subsidized the 2 remaining passenger ships to go across the ocean, and one of them sank. So it was 52 years old, and then subsidized a whole new shipping industry for passengers. That's a sister law, is the Passenger Vessel Act. I think inertia is the easiest path. And the shipyards have voted by leaving construction. I think the Philly shipyard, the reality is 2 of the 3 yards are owned by foreigners. Okay? So they're not American shipyards. And I think Philly's probably going to go out of business. So you may have heard it here second. You probably wrote about it first. I just think it's a smaller pot, and the benefits go to a smaller set of people. It's just very hard to change. And then, the political benefit is the money. And, I think some politicians are simply uneducable. But I agree with him. I think this is an issue the administration could take and actually rebuild an industry, but they really have to get rid of this law. And what would you do from the beginning? We're talking about a 100-year-old law. Right. We didn't have airplanes. Well, we had planes, but they were bi-wings. We didn't have jets. We didn't have a global planet, a world like we do today. It's a great time to jump back in and do something serious. The whole planet's on an economic upswing.
Agreed. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. You're dismissed. I think there's lunch outside. I hope so. Don't come yell at me if there's not.